Hello and welcome to Left, Right and Centre. A marathon 10-hour meeting of the RBI board ended just a short while ago at the headquarters of the central bank in Mumbai. And it appears, at least for now, in resolving its increasingly public war with the government. Before we tell you what did happen at the meeting, here's what did not happen. Urjit Patel did not resign. The government did not invoke Section 7, the law that gives it control of the RBI. And as far as we know, the venerable board members did not throw furniture at each other. What we do know is that it took 10 hours so that the two sides could reach some sort of middle ground on the 3 or 4 main contentious issues that had brought matters to the brink. So, as I mentioned, there's no question of the resignation of the governor or of the invocation of Section 7. Instead, a panel has been set up on sharing the surplus between the RBI and the government. So there's going to be a panel on that. There's also been a decision to ease the loans to the small scale sector, what is called the MSMEs, as well as working with the government to try to figure out how to bring some of these stressed public sector banks from outside the restrictive measures that the RBI has put on them. Now, we don't like saying we told you so, but this is more or less what NDTV had been reporting since the morning. Essentially, our sources, including a board member that I'd spoken to, was telling us that there was an attempt to diffuse the crisis well ahead of the meeting by referring the most contentious issues to committees and by getting the RBI to ease up on some of these other demands of the government, particularly to try and increase liquidity into the system. Now, is this a temporary truce? Or has this left deep divisions which will continue to haunt the very sensitive and very important relationship between the government and between India's central bank? And what does it overall also mean about the relationship between the government and the autonomy of independent institutions like the Reserve Bank of India? And joining us tonight to debate that, to talk about it, is a panel, a terrific panel actually. We have Dr. Ila Patnaik, who's a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. She's also been an economic advisor to the government. Thank you for being here. We also have with us Pooja Mehra, a journalist who writes on the economy. And also joining us is Tamal Bandyopadhyay, consulting editor of the Business Standard, an expert on the banking sector. He's joining us from Bombay. And also here with us, representing the Congress, Mohammad Khan, spokesperson. And we also will be having somebody from the BJP in just a second, in case anyone's wondering. And hopefully we'll also have Neelkant Mishra, who's the Managing Director and India Equity Strategist for Credit Suisse. Can I just ask you, Ila Patnaik, that first of all, was this surprising to you that finally it just tended to be an anticlimax?
No. These are things that should have started coming to the board a long time ago.
Right.
And in fact, RBI is signatory to one of the decisions that all regulations will be brought to the board, which was something that should have been done.
Right.
Unfortunately, it hadn't happened. I wish it was not such a public spat that happened the last few weeks.
Right.
But, it's very healthy to have discussions and it's very healthy for stakeholders to have discussions. This thing about two parties and somebody on the RBI board not being appointed by the government, that's not true. Everybody is appointed by the government. And
yes,
the
of course.
board offers oversight to the management.
Yes.
And regulations need to be done with stakeholder consultation, cost-benefit analysis, and all the good governance principles. So, in some ways, actually, this was something that was expected, that the board should discuss this. And it was a pity that it had not been happening all these years.
So, this is a far more nuanced story than simply trying to ascribe blame to say, A or B is at fault. But broadly, if you were to look at how this could have been avoided, where do you think the responsibility lies? Or who are the stakeholders you think kind of messed up that it actually came to this?
I think the messing up started about 3 to 4 years ago, when it was discussed that many of these things need to, or regulations need to be brought to the board, the equity framework needs to be discussed, and all these things were, in fact 2013 was the time when many of these discussions started.
Sure.
On its part, the RBI was not willing to see that this could lead to an ugly situation,
right.
and the government was not willing to push for change, and legislative change, mind you. We don't just need change in the way the board discusses things,
right,
but we need legislative change as well. So both sides, I would say.
Okay. Tamal Bandyopadhyay, we're still actually waiting, Tamal, for the official RBI statement to come up on its website about what happened, but this is broadly what we've understood has transpired based on, people that we've spoken to, as well as some of the agency reporting on this. But your first comments on the fact that it turned out to be actually not so much shots fired, but everyone holstered their guns and decided to try and bury the hatchet.
No, I think I personally never expected, it's a fight to finish kind of stuff. I think this is the way it should have happened. If you see in the run-up to the board meeting, the kind of various, I don't know what do you call it, discussions or confabulations at various parts in Delhi particularly happened.
Right.
So it was not that, there's a lot of communication between the last board meeting and this board meeting, which probably was not happening earlier. And unfortunately, where I beg to differ with Ms. Patnaik is this: yes, discussions are fine, healthy discussions are fine, but not the way it had panned out over the last fortnight or 3 weeks. I mean, it was fight through Twitters, fight through speeches, fight through selective leaks. Even when the meeting was on today, there was a streaming leaks from various quarters, what was happening, etc., etc. So this is not the way. This is not discussion. This is not a civilized way of discussing things. In some sense, it's a very it could have been avoided. The entire thing could have been avoided.
Okay.
So it's actually I think it's redefined the entire RBI government relationship. Will never be the same again. And other part is that it's a very interesting.
It'll never be the same again, you're saying?
Till now we are discussing RBI autonomy.
Just a second, you're saying it'll never be the same again?
Yeah, it will never be the same again.
In what way?
The point is.
In what way?
No. Yes, I am saying it. No. Yes. In what way? In the sense, so long all the discussions were about Reserve Bank's autonomy or so-called autonomy, whatever you say, within the contours of the RBI Act, where the government is supreme, the sovereign. So it was government which is represented by Finance Ministry versus Reserve Bank of India. And now the autonomy will be fought in the context of RBI governor and his deputies, the RBI management versus the board. So that's the change. That's the change. It's no more the Finance Ministry versus RBI. It is the RBI board versus RBI management.
Okay, so you're saying it's now actually become almost like a sort of an internal war. But at the same time, Mohammad Khan, I want to ask you that in the run-up to the meeting, the Congress was coming out very aggressively about what is going to happen at this board. Chidambaram is saying that the government is determined to capture the RBI, let's put up his tweets, in order to gain control over the reserves. The other so-called disagreements are only a smoke screen, etc., etc.
Absolutely.
That's not happened though. So I mean, we don't have a story, but you don't have a story either.
Well, good. In fact, it is the job of the opposition to raise its voice when it sees something this nefarious take place. Ma'am pointed out that this public spat was unnecessary. She's absolutely right. The clumsy and adversarial nature in which these people handled this entire disputes, as Mr. Mondal said, you saw leaks coming from high-level people in the government, people giving quotes about the fact that, look, Section 7 can be invoked in certain fashion.
No, one second, it wasn't just the government. It wasn't just the government. As Ila Patnaik said, it wasn't just a one-sided thing. It was the RBI as well.
Absolutely. But look at
But then you've only chosen to make it one-sided for, I mean, I suppose for political reasons.
Absolutely. And why have we done that, Vasuji? Because we believe there are certain institutions that must be independent. And everything these people have done, statements given by the political nominee Guru Murthy attest to that the one thing that they were after and the one thing that they couldn't abide was that this institution was beyond their control.
Okay,
there were people who came out and justified the use of Section 7 to take money from their reserves.
But you're still talking about something which didn't happen. So would you at least concede that you were wrong in making these assumptions
Not at
about
all.
how it was going to play out?
I would
because
say-
obviously Mr. Gurumurthy was very much part of this board
Vasuji, I would say
where
otherwise.
no shots were fired.
I would declare success because I say that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And because we all made a hue and a cry, and because this government faced an enormous amount of glare and criticism,
well, that's
they
good
had to
spin.
withdraw. And
Or-
P.N. Vijay, one of their own people,
Okay,
came out
let
and
me just
spoke
bring in
about,
Vivek
about the
Reddy.
appointment of Gurumurthy, and Reddy Saab can answer this. He said, P.N. Vijay, who's their man,
Okay,
said that
Vivek
it is a
Reddy-
hostile action by the Prime Minister in appointing Gurumurthy to the board.
Okay, Vivek Reddy, what?
How do you justify that?
Okay, leaving aside the political rhetoric, Vivek Reddy, the fact is that if Tamal Bandyopadhyay is to be believed, he says that even though it may have led to a diffusing of the crisis for the moment, what has happened is that this has turned the RBI board against itself. And somewhere along the line, the political executive, do you think, is responsible for that?
I think Mr. Srinivasan, Kamal may have got it wrong because as our first panelist said, when you have deep issues related to policy, Mr. Srinivasan Jain, that's when dialogue must start, debate must start. Now here was a genuine case relating to policies. As to what policy is right in the interest of the nation should definitely be discussed by the RBI
Yes.
and should also be discussed within the RBI. Within the parameters of independence of that institution. So therefore, what's happened today, if we look at what's happened today,
Yes.
answering both Kamal and the other panelists, if we look at what's happened today, I think it's the best thing, it's the best sign for this country that
But
the
it's-
board is now looking into certain areas red flagged by the government.
Sure,
Certain
Vivek will-
areas which government said it requires RBI's consideration.
Vivek, we'll get into
So
those.
therefore,
We'll get
if
into
RBI
those.
is
We'll get into
considering
those
those issues-
areas. We'll get into those areas in detail in a second. But I want to ask you broadly, though,
Well,
because
that
we've
is the
got
whole
into those.
discussion
Let me
about.
just ask the question. Let me ask the question. You respond. That we've reached this point after reaching the brink. We had a situation where, after Viral Acharya gave that speech, where he talked about how that you will be invoking the wrath of the markets if you interfere with the independence of the central bank, a speech which many could argue was questionable, and did you really need to use that language? You had the unprecedented situation of a senior official in the finance ministry actually tweeting in response to that, pointing out various positive aspects that had happened in the economy and saying, what about wrath of the markets, mocking essentially this RBI deputy governor. Now that kind of stuff is pretty unprecedented.
Well,
So you go to the brink and
Well,
then you come back from it.
let
That's
me
not
tell you,
necessarily a virtue. Maybe you shouldn't have taken it to the brink in the first place.
no, no.
Mr. Reddy is making a virtue out of
we
a
are not-
necessity.
Okay, hold on. Let him
No, no,
respond.
we
Let
are
me
not.
interrupt you.
We are not looking at this. Yes, Mr. Srinivasan. We are not. Let me just finish. We are not looking at this whole problem from the perspective of a tweet by any government servant. We are looking at this problem holistically as to what is good for the health of the economy of this country.
Right.
The first issue here is red flagged by perhaps an issue open to discussion is how much of capital should be made available
Okay.
in this present economic situation.
All right.
Well, it requires consideration. The RBI is looking at it, and there's a healthy way to go about it, and that's what is happening.
Okay,
so
let me just-
therefore, to say that, for Kamal to say that the relationship will never be the same again,
Yes.
or it is an internal dispute between the management of the RBI and the governors.
Yes.
Well, why are we looking at it so, to
Okay,
such
fine.
an extent?
All right,
Why are
I'll
we
come
trying
back to, I will
segment it,
come back,
fragment
Vivek,
it to
I'll
such
come
an
back to
extent?
you, and I'll also come back to Tamal to
Let's-
give him a chance to respond. Arvind Virmani, former chief economic advisor on the show tonight. What do you make of it, sir? Do you think that while at least for the moment things have calmed down, this has caused deep rifts which may take a long time to heal, or do you think that it is now pretty much blown over?
So very quickly, the background which you have discussed, I think most professionals agree that this taking up to the level of the public contention and public debate was not very healthy, but it has happened. And I think it's important to understand the possible reasons. In my view, it's a combination of two things. One is kind of on one side a too ideological an approach to monetary policy making,
Right.
and on the other side a little bit too much of political approach. And this has combined with some kind of personality
sort of issues which actually go with those two things, because an ideologue always thinks that there is 0 and 1 and 1 is the right one and I have it, so obviously there's nothing to discuss.
Right.
So okay, now given that, what I had proposed, and which is why I'm positive about the outcome, is that what you have to do, the only way to actually resolve issues is, because there's very, very seldom a completely right and a completely wrong approach. Only ideologues think that there is only 0 and 1.
Yes.
And therefore the best way is to take it down into a kind of a professional and technical level and come to some kind of a compromise which is a path.
Right.
If principle is correct, we don't give up the path. I mean, one has been on many, many such committees. There's always some way, in most cases, to find a path to a solution. So in that sense, I think it's a good start that at least for 1 or 2 issues, they have found a path where presumably they will bring in some professional technical input which will give some kind of a compromise.
All right, let me just go across to Nilkant Mishra, and then I'll come to you, Pooja. Nilkant Mishra, is this now going to be viewed positively, particularly by foreign markets as well as foreign governments, as well as the people who invest in India, people whose investments you handle, that there has been now a scaling down of this crisis, because clearly what was happening before was possibly not sending a very good signal?
Absolutely. I think this is a very positive development, and I think the impact of this is much greater than what became very public in the last 2 weeks. I think communication channels between the government and the RBI were not working very efficiently for several months, if not quarters. And the fact that the government and the RBI have managed to come to a consensus on issues which had become apparently so contentious suggests to us that perhaps on other issues as well similar progress can be made, and that's actually very good for the economy.
Okay. Pooja, of course, now in hindsight it all looks so calm and it's all, all is well. But at the time when this was building up, it was getting pretty crazy, right? There was talk that Section 7 had been invoked, or at least consultations had opened up on it. That led to speculation that Urjit Patel was going to resign. So it had really sort of reached the brink.
Yeah, the build-up was in fact completely unprecedented, and I think credit goes to both the back channel in the government and the RBI. And let's not forget that Urjit Patel is reported to have come down to Delhi, met the Prime Minister, met the Finance Minister,
That's right.
probably sorted out, did a bit of give and take, explained his position, probably explained what the risks are in agreeing to all the pressures that were being put on him,
Yes.
and suggest possible solutions. And that is where I guess a whole lot of resolution of the situation took place, and that's why we are seeing today no fireworks.
Right.
But I also want to point out one other thing. You see,
Yes.
if we want the board to take on a bigger role than it has in the past, more than an advisory role, then probably the constitution of the board cannot be where some of the largest indebted companies of India are going to have, their CEOs are going to sit on this board and decide what are going to be the norms and regulation related to, lending from banks. So if that is what the intention is, then...
But that's, would you say that's the case now, at the moment?
We have corporate representatives on the board, don't we?
Yes. Okay. But are they the most indebted?
They may not be the most indebted, but they could be leveraged. They might be at some point in time. So we are going to have to, if they are going to decide regulation, what I'm saying is, and I don't want to talk about specific companies, but we are going to involve the board in regulation, then we are going to have to decide if this is how the board appointments are going to take place.
Okay.